I didn't know it at the time, but the first sign something terrible and powerful was about to surface wasn't the insult. It was the silence that followed it. The kind of silence that settles when a secret is breathing right beneath the table, waiting for the wrong person to laugh too loudly. If you're the kind of person who believes humiliation should never go unanswered, and that hidden strength always finds its moment, go ahead and like and subscribe right now. Because this story begins quietly, but it does not stay kind. I was there the night Marcus laughed at Elena, and I remember thinking how strange it was that a room full of people could feel so small. The restaurant was one of those places designed to make you feel important just for sitting down. Low golden lights, polished marble floors, wine glasses so thin they trembled when you breathed too close. Elena stood near the host's stand, hands folded at her waist, shoulders slightly rounded the way people do when they're trying to take up less space in the world. She hadn't always stood like that. I knew because I remembered her from years earlier. Bright, confident, the kind of woman who walked into a room and changed its temperature. But life had carved something out of her, slowly and without mercy. She was thinner now, her face pale in a way makeup couldn't hide, dark circles shadowing her eyes. Still beautiful, achingly so, but worn, like a violin that had been played too hard for too long. Marcus spotted her almost immediately. He always did. Men like him had a radar for former versions of themselves, the people they'd stepped on to climb higher. He was dressed expensively but carelessly, collar open, watch deliberately visible, laughing too loudly with a group that included his fiancée and two friends who laughed a second too late at every joke. When he recognized Elena, his smile sharpened. He didn't lower his voice. He never did. "Wow," he said, looking her up and down as if she were a curiosity he'd forgotten to throw away. "What happened to you?" The words floated across the room, cutting through the soft music. Elena froze for half a second, just enough for anyone watching to notice, and then she straightened, professional smile locking into place. She asked if they had a reservation. Marcus chuckled. "Still pretending to be important, huh?" His fiancée laughed nervously, uncertain, but Marcus leaned into it, emboldened by the attention. "You used to turn heads," he continued, eyes cold. "Now look at you. Guess life didn't work out once he didn't have me carrying you anymore." Someone shifted uncomfortably. No one intervened. Elena's fingers tightened around the clipboard she was holding, knuckles whitening. I was close enough to see the way her jaw clenched, the way she swallowed hard before answering. "Your table is ready," she said quietly. That should have been the end of it. Marcus could have taken his victory and sat down. But cruelty is rarely satisfied with silence. He laughed again louder. "God, you look tired. Pregnancies suit you that badly." That was the moment the air changed. Elena's eyes flickered, just for a second, and her hand moved instinctively to her stomach, a small, unconscious gesture she immediately corrected. Marcus noticed. His grin widened. "Wait," he said, mock surprise dripping from every syllable. "Don't tell me you let yourself go for someone else. That's rough. No wonder you're like this now. Too ugly to trade up, huh?" I watched Elena's face drain of color. Not because of the insult. She'd heard worse in quieter ways, but because he was closer to the truth than he had any right to be. What Marcus didn't know, what none of us knew yet, was that beneath the black uniform and practiced calm, Elena was carrying a secret that weighed more than shame. She was pregnant. Not just pregnant, pregnant with twins. And not just anyone's twins. But that part of the story hadn't caught up to us yet. Elena had met the father months earlier, long before this restaurant, before Marcus's smug voice echoed across polished walls. Back then, she hadn't known who Luca was, only that he was quiet, controlled, and looked at her like he saw something worth protecting. Their time together had been brief, intense, and ended without explanation. He disappeared the same way storms do, suddenly, leaving damage you don't notice until later. She never told him about the pregnancy, not because she didn't want to, but because the moment she tried to find him, he no longer existed. Under the name she knew. And so she stayed silent, worked longer shifts, moved into a smaller apartment, learned to sleep through nausea and fear. That night, standing in front of Marcus, she was doing the hardest thing of all, surviving quietly. Marcus finally waved her off, satisfied. "Don't worry," he added as she turned away. "Some people just peak early." His friends laughed. Elena walked toward the back hallway, head high, steps steady. But when she passed the mirrored column near the bar, I saw her reflection falter. One hand pressed again to her stomach, protective now, desperate. She thought she was alone. She wasn't. Somewhere beyond the restaurant's walls, far from the laughter and cheap cruelty, a man was being informed that Elena had been seen, that she looked unwell, that she was working again, and that someone had dared to humiliate her. Luca didn't yet know about the twins, but he would. And when he did, the world Marcus thought he understood was going to collapse inward, quietly at first, then all at once. Because insults are easy when you think no one powerful is listening. And secrets are dangerous when they stop being hidden. The shift didn't announce itself with drama or noise. It arrived the way power usually does, quietly and without apology. The morning after the restaurant incident, Elena didn't return to work. By dawn, she was curled on the floor of her apartment, one hand braced against the wall, the other protectively cradling her stomach as waves of pain stole the air from her lungs. When the paramedics arrived, their expressions tightened the moment they checked her vitals. At the hospital, the pace turned urgent, voices overlapping in medical shorthand as monitors beeped in sharp, unforgiving rhythms. Elena stared at the ceiling lights sliding past her, fear blooming in her chest, not just for herself, but for the lives she carried. It was there, in that sterile room, that the truth was finally spoken aloud. Twins. The word echoed in her head, terrifying and miraculous all at once. She barely had time to process it before a nurse stepped into the hallway and made a phone call that wasn't on any public directory. What followed rippled through the building like a pressure change. Security personnel straightened. Doctors lowered their voices. And then Luca Moretti arrived. He didn't rush. He didn't announce himself. He simply walked in, dressed in dark, immaculate clothing, his presence bending the space around him. When his eyes fell on Elena, pale, shaking, exhausted, something in his carefully controlled expression cracked. He hadn't known. Not about the pregnancy. Not about the twins. Elena's voice trembled as she tried to explain, words tumbling over each other in apology and fear. Luca took her hand, grounding her with a quiet certainty. He told her none of that mattered now. Later, away from her bedside, the other side of him surfaced. Calls were made. Doors closed. Names were spoken with deliberate precision. Marcus, meanwhile, was still laughing. He bragged about the night at the restaurant, about how satisfying it had been to see Elena put in her place, unaware that every word was already being weighed. His luck began to rot from the inside out. A business deal collapsed without warning. His bank flagged irregularities that froze his accounts. His fiancée's sudden disappearance felt abrupt and inexplicable, until it didn't. When Marcus was invited to a private office downtown under the promise of opportunity, he walked in confident and walked out hollow-eyed. Lucas sat across from him, calm and unreadable, and explained the reality Marcus had stepped into. No shouting, no threats, just facts. Elena was under his protection. The children she carried were his. And disrespect had consequences. By the time Marcus stumbled back onto the street, his phone was already buzzing with confirmations of everything he'd just lost. Back at the hospital, Elena slept for the first time in weeks, Lucas seated nearby, watching over her and the quiet rise and fall of her breathing. The humiliation she'd endured was no longer the center of her story. It was the final moment before a force she never knew she could claim wrapped itself around her life and refused to let go. The end of Marcus's world didn't arrive all at once, and that was the most punishing part of it. There was no single moment he could point to and say, "This is where it went wrong." Only a slow, suffocating collapse that followed him everywhere. I watched it happen from the outside. The way you watch a building being dismantled brick by brick while the person inside insists it's just a draft. His name stopped opening doors. Calls went unanswered. Meetings were postponed indefinitely until they simply vanished from his calendar. People who once leaned in close to hear his jokes now leaned away, suddenly busy, suddenly cautious. He tried to fight it at first, lawyers, complaints, threats, but every effort only seemed to tighten the invisible net around him. No one ever said Luca Moretti's name out loud in Marcus's presence. They didn't have to. Fear had its own language. Meanwhile, Elena's life was transforming in ways she never imagined she would allow herself to want. After weeks of careful monitoring, she was moved from the hospital to a secure residence overlooking the city, a place filled with light and quiet and the steady reassurance of safety. At first, she walked through the rooms like a guest afraid of overstaying her welcome, still flinching at raised voices, still apologizing for taking up space. But Luca never treated her like something fragile or temporary. He listened when she spoke. He asked before deciding. He made it clear, without ever raising his voice, that her comfort was not a courtesy but a priority. I saw her begin to sleep through the night, her body no longer braced for disaster. I saw her laugh one afternoon, surprised by the sound of it, as if she hadn't realized she still remembered how. The twins grew stronger, their movements more confident, and with every passing week Elena's posture changed, shoulders back, chin lifted, one hand resting naturally over her stomach not in fear, but in quiet pride. Luca spoke to the twins often, telling them stories of strength and legacy, promising them a world where their mother would never be diminished again. He never framed himself as her savior, and that mattered more than anything. He treated Elena as an equal, someone who had endured, adapted, and survived without ever knowing how protected she truly was. The reckoning came not with violence, but with visibility. Luca hosted a private gathering one evening, an invitation-only affair attended by people who understood power in its purest form. Elena stood beside him, dressed elegantly, her pregnancy impossible to ignore and intentionally unhidden. Conversations paused when they entered. Eyes followed her, not with judgment, but with calculation and respect. Whispers rippled through the room, but none of them were cruel. This was not a woman to be mocked. This was a woman carrying heirs, standing unbroken after being underestimated. I thought of Marcus then, alone somewhere, probably scrolling through his phone, tried to understand how he had gone from laughing in a restaurant to being erased from relevance. He never confronted Elena again. He never dared. His punishment wasn't public humiliation. It was irrelevance, the knowledge that the woman he'd called ugly now lived in a world he would never be allowed to touch. As the night wore on, Elena moved through the room with quiet confidence, accepting nods and respectful greetings, her presence steady and undeniable. Luca watched her the way you watch something precious you once feared you'd lost forever. When she rested her head briefly against his shoulder, the room seemed to understand something fundamental had shifted. This wasn't revenge for revenge's sake. This was balance being restored. Elena hadn't needed to scream, fight, or prove herself to anyone. She had simply endured long enough for the truth to rise. And as I looked at her that night, radiant, protected, powerful in ways that had nothing to do with fear, I understood the real lesson of it all. The worst thing Marcus ever said wasn't an insult. It was a confession of how small he truly was. And the greatest thing Elena ever did was survive quietly until the world was forced to see her clearly.